I guess one takeaway would be that this is happening here in New York City and in the United States.
What I'd like you to take away is that this is a matter of life and death. It is a matter of basic safety for the ones who become a victim of these practices, and that you have the choice to know, acknowledge, and if you want, not turn away, but do everything in your power to save that life or to guarantee that girl's safety.
Mine follows from what Ayaan said, that the first contact is the most important contact. So you've got to have processes in place to ensure that if any victim seeks assistance, you either know the answer or you can signpost them before it escalates into more serious harm.
Believe your victims. Believe what they're selling you, and take it for real.
I'd echo everything my colleagues have said, but also to say we're at the beginning here in the United States in dealing with this issue, and we have a long ways to go, but I think through creative advocacy and zealous advocacy, you can definitely save people's lives and help give them a lifeline to be able to get out of the situation that they're in.
Yeah, the mics.
Thanks.
You guys come forward, there are enough seats.
Do you need to repeat what you said? Go ahead. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the really nice introduction, Rick. It's nice to have a chance to respond to this question first off. Having listened to many of the speakers, you should understand the gravity, I think, by now. I also want to make clear, if there's one thing I could ask you to take away as a New York service provider, let that be that this is not a problem with no solutions right now in New York. This is not something where we have to sit and say, let's hope one day there are laws. Let's hope one day everybody understands. We can all react now. If there are people who are coming to you on the front lines, if you have colleagues who are on the front lines, if you're a teacher, a social worker, you know a teacher or a social worker, educate them. That's number one. Number two is the laws, as Heather was saying earlier, are in place. Here in New York, we have child protection laws, we have child abuse laws, we have assault laws, we have rape laws. We have laws that can be used even before specific laws are passed, if they are. So please report, please encourage those who are mandated reporters to take this seriously. Please call Sanctuary for Families. We are here, we are huge. We're more than 150 staff members providing social services and legal services in all boroughs of New York and the region. We have walk-in offices all over the city. We have appointment offices, whatever. My contact information can be made available to you, and please do get help when there are victims in your path.
Given all the resources that we're beginning to get here, what would you say are the biggest obstacles to helping victims? I mean,
I think it's lack of knowledge, and we are committed to correcting that. It's fear of cultural stereotyping, fear of repercussions for yourself. I think that sometimes those fears are exaggerated. I'm pointing to Nazir Afzal. I mean, he's really out there in the open, in your face, doing it day in, day out, and he said the only people he's afraid of are his sons. I think it also has to do with, it's the egg and the chicken. A lot of people ask me, so how big is the problem? Because if I say, well, maybe, we don't know, but they say compared to, how many people are affected by HIV/AIDS? How many people are affected by cancer? It's easy to quantify maladies like that because people talk about it and can't talk about it, even though they're life-threatening. So let's assume even if you can save one life, even if it's just one, you've made a huge difference. But it's one of the obstacles, yeah.
From my perspective, it's not about the victim, it's about us making assumptions And that's the main obstacle. You assume if she comes in on Valentine's Day, a woman walks into a police station and says, "I've been sent a bunch of flowers, my family want to kill me." And you think, well, I wish they sent me a bunch of flowers. You know, you make assumptions based on your own prejudices and the way you live your life. But as we've heard already time and time again, you believe her. She knows her family, but we've made those assumptions based on our own experiences. So we've got to put our assumptions aside, reflect on what she has said, understand her knowledge of the situation, and act upon it. And I think only when we start doing that are we going to be in a position to be wholesale supporters of victims up and down the country.
I can't really add a whole lot more to that. It's pretty much we as law enforcement, we as social service providers have to change our way of thinking. That historically we think that the best thing for these people to do is to return to their family. That's what's been ingrained to us as social workers. That's what's been ingrained to us as law enforcement officers, that, you know, the best place for children that are running away or leaving is their families. That's not the case in these situations, so we need to fundamentally change the way we think when we're dealing with these types of situations.
I have to echo the education piece, and I think it's education in two prongs. It's education for service providers and for law enforcement, for all of the support services that are out there, making sure they see the issue of forced marriage as something that's falling as a child protection issue, as a domestic violence issue, as something that's a fundamental human rights violation that they should extend their doors, open their doors, extend services to. I also think we need education for the people who are the potential victims, because a lot of the individuals I work with, they don't know that they can turn to somebody. They don't know that they can say no. They don't feel comfortable speaking out and asking for help. And so getting into schools, working with youth, it's very, very important to ensure that people are aware of their freedoms and rights.
I think for me, a challenge, and just speaking very honestly, I think, yes, the challenges are certainly finding the people who need the help and getting them to safety. In my experience, another big challenge is keeping them safe after that point. When we are working with young women who come out of a family or come out of a community where they were at risk, there's a sense of relief and exhaustion and sadness and mourning. There are a lot of emotions in place there, and it's complicated. And we offer counseling, but it's hard to convince somebody that they should be very happy that they now have nobody in this world to take the place of their family. So we have to provide them a holistic services and embrace them for all their needs and all their varied emotions in the aftermath of finding safety. And that requires no judgment on our part, and that was already stated, but I think it, for me anyway, as a provider, I have to keep saying that to myself on and on and on. So for those of you who are working with people in this situation, realize that it's all of us who are doing this even day in and day out. We all have to keep reminding ourselves of the same thing.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead. No, please.
So, thank you. This kind of encompasses everything that was talked about in the last 5 minutes and all day today about obstacles and creative intervention and child protective services. We talked a lot about how minor cases are some of the most difficult, but there are also a large number of cases that happen, and how child protective services, our child protective services system is not quite there yet, in that it's geared towards parental rights. So when you were advocating to report to child protective services, is that the best thing that we should be doing now, knowing that, you know, they could be sent back to their family? And what are some of those additional creative interventions? And I think Nazir would, I don't know how your child protective services works in England, but some of those lessons learned with that as well, I'd be interested in hearing.
I mean, Heather may have different views on this than I do, but I think one of the things that we do at Sanctuary is we go we try to establish relationships with teachers and guidance counselors and people who are mandated reporters so that they understand that lawyers are not mandated reporters. And sometimes I have had guidance counselors or social workers and teachers call me and say, I suspect something is going on. I'm nervous to ask too many questions because I don't know what's going to happen if I make a phone call. And without a lot of protocols in place at this stage in our advocacy on this issue, I can understand that fear. So what we do at Sanctuary is we offer, quick consultations, lengthy consultations with any person who might think a young person is at risk. I have gone to high schools and done what I call clinics. So I sit in a room, in a classroom by myself or an office, and students can sign up to speak one-on-one with a lawyer on a confidential basis. And then they come talk to me, and I can assess. Sometimes I have recommended to the student, I think you should probably talk to somebody who can get help from Child Protective Services, or I've accompanied them to make a police report, or we've discussed getting an immigration case started so that they feel they have the rights they need in order to, the status they need to pursue their rights. We have done family court cases. We have taken young people into juvenile shelters. I mean, there are a lot of things that can be done, but I think that fear that there could be an on-off switch with a phone call has to be kind of abated. And there are a lot of us in the community who can help and who can offer different kinds of conversations and different kinds of services. So we all have to kind of know about each other and be sure that we're offering the services we can.
Let me let Ayaan respond to that as well.
I want to respond to that by saying let's go one step back and think more closely about, we talked about education, we talked about informing people, we talked a lot about assumptions today that we have. And what I find over and over again is that our knowledge of these communities is very superficial. An example, when we talk about marriage, we assume states, people getting married before the state. I got married before the state of Massachusetts. But if you look at a phenomenon we haven't brought up today, Sharia law, there's so many cases of arranged and forced marriages that we don't know about because they're not registered anywhere. Because this goes to a Sharia tribunal that may or may not be recognized, and you have all these girls and guys that are trapped in it. And I'm sure that in other communities, there is some way of, religiously, informal religious mandated law that they go through. So we don't know about these people. Another bit of superficial knowledge, marriage. It was very interesting that one of the interviewers said she talked to some of the individuals she talked to, some of them were Americanized. It means that their concept of marriage is Americanized. In the concept of marriage that I was discussing this morning of honor and shame, the two individuals are not seen as spending the rest of their lives in loving partnership, and today he does the dishes and tomorrow she does the dishes. The two individuals very often don't have anything in common. If they grow up in two different countries, they don't even speak the same language. They may be first blood cousins, but they may be complete strangers to one another. And what's expected in that household is that the women and the girls occupy one part of the house and the males occupy the other part of the house, and the children are brought up that way. So your concept of marriage and of choosing and of loving and everything that you think you understand marriage, but you don't really understand the concept of marriage here. So there's all of this that goes on, and I think that is very superficial. We need to take a genuine, deep interest in these other cultures, and therein we'll find things that we are attracted to, things that are wonderful, but equally, some of these cultures and some of these religions have features that are outdated and that violate human rights, basic human rights, not just women's rights.
I mean, you asked about the United Kingdom. I mean, I can't speak to how Child Protective Services work in the United States. I see a lot on Twitter about it, which suggests maybe it's not working as well as it could. But from our perspective, every statute, every bit of policy, every process relating to children starts with the line, the welfare of the child is paramount. That's where you start. And I think we need to approaching these issues around that. You know, what the parent might want, what the social services might want, are totally irrelevant as far as I'm concerned. What does the child want? And we've been doing a lot of education of judges, actually, in the last few years, particularly family court judges, to make them aware of the kinds of issues that we've been talking about during the course of today. And when they don't go in the main, they don't go into a situation blind anymore. They did. Now they can see when the wool is being pulled over their eyes. Now they can see when expediency is what's happening here. They simply just want to get it off their, get it out of court and whatever, So from our perspective, always remember the child goes first, and the child is first. And if you do that, I think you will find more and more people will begin to realize that you can't allow this to continue to happen as it does.
Nazir, I wanted to follow up, actually, and we in the U.S. are impressed with the degree of coordination that the UK has brought between the government and NGOs and various partnerships around this issue. And I guess the question I have is, how'd you do that? And what advice how can we do that, What do we do?
Well, I mean, Rick, I think you are doing it. That's the point is that everything that government is doing is led by victims and survivors and by NGOs. They don't know what's out there until they're told what's out there. And if you have, you don't need a march of thousands. What you need is survivors talking about their experiences. What you need is victims constantly being interviewed or whatever it may be to explain what's happened to them, and then building up that narrative. Our narrative up to now has been twofold. One is victims come forward and we'll support you and we'll encourage you to come forward. And the second thing is that forced marriage, honor-based violence is bad. And in the run-up, this is something you actually can be ahead of the game on. In the run-up to criminalization next year, our narrative is changing. It's going to be tweaked a little bit. Our narrative is going to be forced marriage, honor-based violence is bad for you. Because we want to make the point that those communities or families that make this happen are damaging their own families. They are damaging their own children. They are ensuring that the advancement of those communities is not as fast as the advancement of other communities. There's an economic detriment when you marry your child off at 13 or you don't allow your child to be educated. And so we want to change the narrative to make, so at the same time as we're saying it's bad, we're doing multiple strands at the same time. But I think the other point is about leadership. Forget me, there are tons of leaders in the NGOs particularly who are vocal, who are sharing information. One of the things I picked up very early on actually was they hated each other actually. The NGOs hated each other because they seemingly were fighting for the same funding. And similarly, universities, when they wanted to do research, they were all fighting for the same research funding. And so in the first couple of years, there was a lot of tension. And what we started to do was actually, we started to bring them together, put them in the same room, let them have 15 rounds, And at the end of 15 rounds, they saw what the objective was, which was that victim. And I think ultimately that's how you do it.
I think we still, in the US, we need to learn a lot from you. And I know that there are places where good things are happening, but there are places where nothing is happening. And I want to illustrate this with one case. And some of you may have followed the case of Shaima Alawari, an Iraqi woman, 32 years old, mother of 5, who in April of this year was found in a pool of blood in her house. And the family said there was a note lying next to her that said, "Go back to your country, you terrorist." I've been following that case very closely, and before I came to this conference, I Googled the name Shaima Alawari, and I saw blogs. For instance, one blog on CNN still marketing that as a hate crime. It occurred in about the same weeks as the Trayvon Martin case in Florida. But a few days after Shaima's body was found, divorce papers were discovered in her car. There was a report, the affidavit was leaked to the press, and so it was all out in the open. but her 17-year-old daughter was allegedly having sex a few months prior and had been reported to the mother, and the mother picked her up, and the 17-year-old girl jumped out of the car and ended up in the emergency room. And the reports of the emergency room doctor who saw her, he said that she jumped out of the car because she was afraid of a forced marriage. So here you have two incredibly important leads that tell you that this may not be a hate crime. But meanwhile, the body was transported out of the country. The family went to Iraq and they haven't been back. And the Council of American Muslim Organizations and other Muslim organizations continue putting this story out as a hate crime. One more thing that will just make you think about this. Shaima is 32 years old, or was 32 years old when she died. Her daughter, 17. She got married here. So it tells you not only that these things are happening here now, but 17 years ago, and it's a hidden case. And I want to ask Chris, if you'll allow me, you being from the law, and anyone else from law enforcement, isn't it scandalous that that case is completely closed?
Well, I'm not sure if it's completely closed. It's an ongoing homicide investigation or murder or death investigation. I was contacted by the La Mesa, California Police Department on this case and provided some input. One caveat to the note that was left there by the suspects, it was a photocopy. It wasn't a valid copy, so there was some tampering going on there. La Mesa PD is holding this case very close to the vest, but when I looked at the case, just as a casual observer from the outside, reading only what was in the media, it was very clear and very apparent what this was, what type of case this was. No question in my mind, and why the investigation is being conducted in the manner in which it's being conducted now, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not privy to that. Even though they asked me for input, they didn't give me a whole lot of information in return. So I think we're probably running into a lot of issues that we discussed earlier in that area. And the police department not wanting to be portrayed as being culturally insensitive or targeting a specific group. And again, my thought on that is that's a bunch of crap.
But what can we do? What can we do? Can we, I mean, from on a grassroots level, from the ground up, what can we do to pressure?
Well,
and what can we learn from the UK?
Well, and I think, you know, every one of us that pays taxes, we work for you as law enforcement. I think we need to be held to standards. If there's a, and we as law enforcement also know that the squeaky wheel usually gets grease. So as citizens have questions, as citizens have issues with perhaps the way things are going, they can certainly make those concerns voiced and contact their local police department. Is that going to effectively change the way some police departments do business? I'm here to tell you that no, it's not. But by the same token, I think if continual pressure or at least displeasure is voiced, things will change. Things will change because ultimately, like I said, we as law enforcement do work for the citizens and the public at large.
Obviously, I don't know enough. I don't know enough about the case. Obviously, I've heard what Ayaan was talking about it earlier on. From my perspective, we have a little bit easier. You have your local police, you have your state police, you have your federal police. I'm sure you have other polices. I've no idea. A point is that whilst we have county police forces, we have one national police force, and additionally, we have one district attorney. In effect. So we can tell the police, we don't accept what you've done in this case, go off and do some more we don't accept what's going on so far. Similarly, we can escalate it. So if the public petition, and they don't, by that I don't mean 100,000 names. What I mean is you go on television or you go on radio, you start a campaign, you go on Facebook, whatever it is, to tell people, I don't accept what's going on in this case. Before you know it, somebody with influence has heard that and wants that reviewed by somebody else. And I think it ultimately comes down to sort of keeping the momentum going. I've dealt with some cases, I think I mentioned earlier on, where it took, in Tule Goran's case, it took 13 years from her disappearance to the conviction, 12 and a half before we had any evidence. And in Sturgeon's case, it took 10 years. In Stephen Lawrence, 17 years before we were able to prosecute his killers. No homicide or no death is closed as an inquiry. So it's important to keep that pressure on. Eventually, what I've learned actually around honor-based violence and forced marriage, Ayaan, is that loyalties change. So today I might say, I love my family, I will keep my counsel, I will not talk about this. In a few years' time, I hate you, I'm going to tell the police everything. And as long as the police or some agency has kept contact with the individuals in their family and built the relationship, they'll be able to break down the wall of silence and have the evidence they need to bring the case.
Oh, hold on so we can get the mic. Here it comes. There you go.
Thank you for your presentation. At the beginning, when you were speaking about the research that your organization did, I might have missed it. So first of all, who were the people that were a part of that survey and research that you collected? That's the first part of my question. And you made a statement that you were looking at a broad spectrum or a broad picture, that it isn't just one particular people group or community of people, and that you gave an example. For example, if a Catholic or Christian young girl got pregnant, there were ramifications. And I just wonder that in the statistics and research you've done, if you could give me a percentage of the number of Christians that have honor killed their daughters as a result of a pregnancy or not wanting to marry the man that they chose.
With regards to the survey that we conducted, the respondents, I didn't show the slide with the breakdown of the respondents, but the respondents came from all different kinds of organizations. So it wasn't the individual victims themselves responding. It was, say, law enforcement, it was other social service providers, legal service providers, educators, medical professionals, and there's a breakdown of the survey respondents in the survey report. Regarding honor violence and Catholic families, I don't have an example off the top of my head. Again, when we did this research, there really hadn't been anything done before. So we were just trying to see, what does this issue look like in the United States? We suspected there were going to be some close parallels to the UK, but we tried to cast as wide a net as we could, and ask people just to share with us what were the family backgrounds of the individuals that you saw that came to you and identified that they were facing some kind of forced marriage situation, and then what were their religious backgrounds too. And so that's how we got that data. We didn't do any kind of cross-questioning about putting those two things together. And the survey was more focused on the issue of forced marriage, not forced marriage and honor violence. And I hope that there will be some continued research into the intersection of those issues, as well as both issues separately as well.
Actually, in our surveys that we're doing, we've already interviewed Muslim, Hindu, and Christian people. So we're hoping to get, because we understand that honor killings don't only happen within particular communities, that there's, I'm discovering that there's lots of people that actually do it, more than I thought. I mean, I don't have clarity on it. I'm just discovering that there's something more for me to find out about, Because
for me, it feels like, I'm just going to put myself right on the limb, and you can all verbally chop me up when I go out the door. There is an elephant in this room today that we're not willing to address because we're afraid to address, because we've all become somewhat weak and compliant. And I just want to say, that's why I'm asking very specific targeted questions. So when you put the thing out there that says we're seeing it in all, I want to know what that looks like, because I work in the Middle East and I know my audience and I know what it's about. So I need to step outside of 22 countries and know what is happening on the panorama of the US and who are these people that are doing it. I can pretty much tell you. I'm not afraid to say it because I'm not winning a popularity contest. But if there are others, I do want to know because it's affecting my community, and how can I help?
Well, I think you have a point. And the point that there is a pink elephant when it comes to radical Islam, that is true. And the issue, all the issues we are talking about, if you take and look at all the communities, I said this morning, if you look at all the communities where these things occur, you will see that a majority of the cases take place within Muslim families. That is absolutely true. What makes our lives difficult, if you will, is it took, when I first started talking about honor killings and honor violence, people were very keen to change the subject. So it took us a long time and a lot of energy for that particular community, members of that community, to come out and say that these things were happening in their communities. When I published Infidel, I got letters from Catholics, from Hindus, and other community members who said, what you describe in terms of the psychological pressure and in terms of, with Catholics it wasn't so much honor killings, but there was so much pressure and pushing and I would say brainwashing individuals into doing things that they didn't want to do that concerned women and inferior position that was allocated to them. But the scale of the violence, the scope of the violence, the individuals that are affected, if you are saying that that happens within Muslim families more than in other families, you're absolutely right. But the next step is how to go about that without shutting that door.
I mean, I wasn't shy this morning. I told you that in the United Kingdom, 2/3 of honor killings takes place in the Muslim communities that we have. And I think it's important to recognize that, otherwise you're not going to see it happening. The danger, of course, of just focusing on that 2/3 is that when a Hindu girl or a Sikh girl or a Jewish girl comes forward and says, I'm being threatened because of honor, you'll say, well, it doesn't happen in your community, apparently. And so you then shut her out. So I think it's absolutely essential that you don't exclusively deal with it on, I say, a religious basis or a community basis. You deal with it on the signs, the triggers that Heather and others were showing you earlier on.
Please, may I add one point?
Please.
What complicates matters even more is the advent of radical Islam as a philosophy. Radical Muslims are establishing mosques and Muslim centers and all kinds of institutions where they have become successful not so much in forcing people. So immigrants in the West, many of them are not forced into becoming radicals, they're persuaded. It's a long process of brainwashing. And so you're absolutely right to bring religion, and particularly Islam, into the picture. And if we don't take that into the picture, then we're not really dealing with this problem in a serious way. But it also takes, we have to persuade our audience today, who are service providers, that there is a phenomenon called honor killing, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, etc., what it is, why it's different from other domestic violence, and then bring in what religion has to do with it. If I were addressing an audience of Muslims, say with the profile of some of the people who were interviewed, then I would absolutely alert them to the spread of radical Islam and how that is transforming their communities. But that is a different audience.
What happens to these kids 6 months, a year, 2 years after they come in for help? Where do they live, school, work?
Depends. I mean, we try our best to secure as long-term a solution as possible for individuals. We're lucky that there are some shelters out there that do have longer periods that an individual can stay, sometimes up to years, instead of just a month or a week. We also look for things like transitional housing. I know a lot of advocates, we try to find a way to kind of ease them into a life that is safe for them. I think, though, that it is a precarious road, and as many of the panelists have noted, there is a need for that extended support. And I do hope that we have a growing network of survivors that come forward to create those support networks, to provide the boost and the connections that you need when you've effectively cut your relations with your family, left your past life, and moved forward with a life of your own, which can be very challenging and daunting, especially if you're very young.
Just to add to that, in addition to all the things Heather said, we have also assisted our clients with changing their names, with moving to other states, to obtaining new legal counsel and a brand new slate of everything somewhere else, so that they can, we get them in schools so that they can go to college, eventually get jobs. I mean, we have job training and things in New York in our offices, but we're only based in New York. So for those people who remain safe in New York or who come to us from another jurisdiction, we're able to provide what we can here. But we have felt heartbroken when we've had to say, I'm sorry, but this is no longer a safe jurisdiction for you, and put some of our clients on planes to sister organizations in other parts of the country where they're safer. And we've managed a lot of changed identities. It's like witness protection, but we're doing it from the NGO side. It looks like that.
We do the same thing, and we also try to offer, connect the person with continued counseling and other types of outside support. And I think too, we just try to have an open door policy. If somebody needs to reach back out for help, that they can still contact us. There's been some cases that we've been involved with well beyond when they may typically be closed from a legal sense, because we are still kind of galvanizing response, galvanizing the support networks that we need to enable individuals to live a safe life.
What percent of them do you think 2-3 years later have a good quality of life?
It's hard for me to say what percentage. Of our clients, we've had, good success because we are holding their hand and we're making sure that that's what happens. I think there are probably a lot of people out there who don't have the support and don't have good quality of life. To have good quality of life means, what does it mean? What does that mean to you or me or to that young person? Probably it means some sort of independent economic status, probably means immigration status. Those things may be possible, but do they feel the happiness and joy of community? Probably not, and that's a much harder thing to quantify and measure for all of us. But I think for the clients we've worked with and who we've talked to a few years later, they are relieved that they are making their own choices in their lives, and so it's all been worth it. And that's kind of what keeps us doing what we're doing.
Our clients experience the same thing. That their primary goal is usually to get to some kind of safe place and have some kind of autonomy and freedom to make their own decisions and take their own course in life. And so when we've stayed in touch with clients, other things may be imperfect, but they've regained that self-identity, that freedom to have self-determination, and that's really a critical aspect of what they've done by courageously coming forward and asking for assistance.
Obviously the most important they have is they have their life, which I think we can't forget. From our experience, one of the bits of learning is that absolutely right, you have to have a network of support. The idea, I used to do this trick with an audience, get them to close their eyes and imagine everything they have, your Facebook friends, your neighbors, your school, your grocery shop, or whatever that's called in this country, et cetera, and then immediately it's gone. The moment you report it, it's gone. So what do you replace it with? And from our understanding is that you've got to give them that or something like that for the rest of their lives. We made some mistakes. Some young lady from East London, which is very minority based community, send them to as far north in Scotland as possible, where they stand out like the proverbial sore thumb. And it was the worst thing you could do to her. And what did she want to do? Go back home. Far from actually protecting her, you're putting her in more danger. So, and also, we haven't touched upon bounty hunters at all during the course of today. But we've got, that's a phenomenon that we're very much aware of. People, again, not necessarily for money, they do it out of whatever they do it out of, some ridiculous motive. Honor, absolutely. They're more than happy to spend the rest of their lives trying to find her. And using confidential databases and whatever they have access to in order to find her. So we have to recognize that. And sometimes the best thing is to hide them in plain sight. Yeah, bizarrely, you know, moving them to a similar community in another part of the country is actually safer for them than to move them where they will be the only person of that particular kind.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, people talked about the need for education to increase awareness and increase the numbers of folks that are interested. But in some ways, I'm curious about that. I know in a lot of other fields that I go to, that when I go to events, I'm preaching to the converted, you know, and nobody wants to preach to converted, but nobody wants to go in front of a hostile audience necessarily either, you know. So what I'm a bit curious about is, in your opinion, what is the low-hanging fruit on the friendship tree for us, you know? What groups specifically? And I'll tell you why I asked this. Earlier today, one of the chairs of one of the departments from John Jay came to see me, and she said, "Oh, what are you doing in here?" And I explained to her what we're doing, and she said, "Oh," she said, "my daughter's friend came to me yesterday and told me that they have an anti-honor killing club at their high school. And, an anti-forced marriage club at their high school." And I said, I mean, who knew, you know? So I'm sort of curious about what you folks think about who are natural allies besides the NGOs and, you know, the people that we're thinking about already. Who should we be reaching out to that are going to be useful for us and increase our numbers?
I think, Nazir, you know this much better than I do. But one low-hanging fruit is, if you look at counterterrorism efforts, obviously they do rely a lot on technology and other means, but they also rely on so-called informants, people who are embedded within the community and who give them information. That is an asset. That is a low-hanging fruit, because the communities overlap. What is also low-hanging fruit, I find, are, and again I point to one of the students, but there are families who first, because they're in a place long enough, adopt Western style, or rather Western lifestyles, and slowly an important member of the family decides to go back or is affected by extremist literature. And it's that individual who then proceeds, if that's a father or a senior brother, who then proceeds to try and control the rest of the family. What is low-hanging fruit is that moment when the extremist is the minority in the family. Because over a year, it could just be the majority, and then you have, that's another low-hanging fruit. Schools, neighborhoods, some mosques.
I would say that we're trying to reach out to New York City guidance counselors and truancy officers. So one of the things we've realized that if a 12 or 13-year-old girl gets pulled out of school, gets homeschooled, taken out, if something else is happening, like that girl is being locked in a room or taken abroad, who's going to report that girl missing? Usually it would be the family, but if the family is responsible for that girl going missing, we need to have truancy officers and guidance counselors notice when girls start disappearing.
So I'm about to sing a song. Can I add two things? One, Rick, there was some research done by Professor Hilliard at Queen's University in Northern Ireland about 25 years ago during the troubles that we had in Northern Ireland. And his research headline was, "The first victim of a terrorist is the woman in his own home." So, you know, because the camera's on, I can't give you any specific examples, but I can assure you we have disrupted counter-terrorism groups. Not counter-terrorism groups, but terrorism groups, by the way they treat women. And as a result, we've made the country and the world safer. So there's your business case, first up. Secondly, in terms of another low-hanging fruit, children, young people, don't listen to me anymore. Well, not even mine do. But they do listen to other children. And some good practice around the world, particularly in Scandinavia, for example. Do you know where that is? Sweden, Denmark. What they've done is they've identified a large group of young people They call them the SHIELD project in Sweden. About 20, 25 young people in their late teens. They've skilled them up, they've given them the tools, and they send them out into schools. Peer-to-peer stuff, you know, children talking to children in effect, and that has been massively successful in a way that if I went in, and I suspect if many of us went into that school, they'd listen, but they wouldn't take away the messages, quite frankly, that they can take away from listening to 15-year-olds talking about it.
Fabulous. Yeah, if I went to the school, they'd call me a pedophile, but okay. But that's how it is these days, you know?
Thank you. I want to ask a question. How do you uncover and go about taking on cases involving female genital mutilation? Because I haven't heard you speak about that yet.
Sure. So I feel female genital mutilation I don't think has been sort of defined, addressed, discussed in full today. It's sort of a related issue and an issue that comes up very often in these types of cases, but it also exists separately from forced marriage and honor crimes. Still, you know, when we at Sanctuary for Families are very much involved in a campaign to address female genital mutilation that's happening here in the United States. FGM happens here. Cutters are brought here to the United States, and there is cutting going on in New York City. In addition, there are young women, as was said earlier, who are flown overseas to go through it. We have found, it's a little, I have found anyway, that there are many young people who are ready to talk about FGM in a way that I'm not finding with honor violence and with forced marriage. I think that there is a little bit more dialogue happening these days around FGM in the communities in which I work anyway. And so the schools model that I agree with Men and what she said earlier, that schools are really the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, or the points of entryway in reaching young people. We do a lot of education on FGM in the schools, and we are finding a lot of young people coming forward and saying this is an issue that's confronted me. And the reason we went to schools is that there was a case that I encountered in 2007, right after I started at Sanctuary, and it was a young woman who was 13, and she was 14 years old when she first started telling a guidance counselor that her family wanted to send her back to her home country to be cut. And she kept describing it and coming back to his office and saying the pressures she was under and the physical violence she was enduring because she was refusing, and the guidance counselor never reported it, and he never did anything. And when we spoke to him years later, he said that he understood it to be a cultural issue and not a safety issue, and not an issue that required reporting. So that's when we sort of took up this mantle of we have to start educating people as to what this is. So many people in the community now, in the New York area anyway, are aware of a number of community-based organizations and legal service organizations that provide services around FGM. And young people are, as was said earlier, remarkably good at listening to each other. So we have a youth advisory group that we work with. There are a number of young people in the community who are sort of eyes and ears. They are talking to their friends. Every couple of days, there's this one young woman who is very, very active, and it felt like every few days. For a while, it slowed down a little, but she would call me, I have another friend, and I have another friend, and I have another. I was like, wow, you're very popular. But she had a lot of friends who needed help, who were on the verge of being cut, or who had just been cut, or who were dealing with it. And so it was really just word of mouth. The more that they spoke with each other, the more that we were getting the referrals, and we were able to respond. And safety in those, there are moms as well, many mothers and some fathers who come to us and say, there's pressure from the community for me to send my child home. And I don't want to send my child home, but I don't know how to face this pressure. You know, mixed culture marriages where one partner wants the child to be cut and the other doesn't. And so we have done interventions in those situations. We have held passports. We've worked with the State Department to talk about transportation of especially U.S. citizen children when one parent doesn't want it and the other does. We've been working on this issue from every angle we can think of. I think it's still, there's always a case that presents a new problem that we haven't addressed before. But so it's somewhat similar in the sense there's sometimes emergency triage, and in other cases we have time and distance from which we can operate and help people. So it kind of depends on the situation. But I think we had done numbers at one point, and we served in 2011 11,000 individuals at Sanctuary. And some very large percentage of those people are immigrants. I think something like 80 to 90% of our clients are immigrants. And within that group, another, I think it was around 20% were from countries where FGM was practiced. And so from there, you can kind of guess at numbers, but it's a very large group of people who are serving every year facing these issues.
I just wanted to say one thing about female genital mutilation. It is the most frustrating issue to address. And in my experience as a legislator in the Netherlands, it wasn't hard to start the conversation about it because no one religion claims it. It wasn't hard to inform the entire nation about it and get most of the population appalled and crying out to their legislators, this has to stop. It wasn't difficult to get to the Minister of Health to issue an investigation through pediatricians and come up with a number that the number of cuttings, as they call it, the cutting of the genitals of kids in the Netherlands was so high that this was something we really should and must do something about. So why should we be frustrated? So why don't we just stop it? Zero prosecution, even though we knew about 19,000 approximately a year. Two things. One, 90% of the cases are done to children between the ages of, say, 5 to 10. Occasionally there are teenagers, 13, 14, who will come out and start talking to their girlfriends and so on. But even they will not step forward and say, this was done to me by so-and-so. So basically you don't have a case. I proposed a control program, very systematic. You map the communities where this takes place according to World Health Organization reports, let's say 90%. So in the Netherlands we had Somalis, Egyptians, Sudanese, and Eritreans. In each of those countries, 98% of females are mutilated to a certain degree. So in our communities in the Netherlands, you could extrapolate. You could say even if it happened 50 or 60 times, these are the communities to focus on. Let's establish a control group. There was an incredible outcry from NGOs, and NGOs sometimes are a force for good, but sometimes NGOs are not a force for good. And they said that that would be violating the human rights of the child to have an inspection. Now, what would the inspection be? You would go to a female doctor and she would establish whether it happened or not. You're a pediatrician. It was taken off the table. The Minister of Health was compelled to do something about it, and ultimately he instituted a control system that was voluntary. In other words, the parent was required to come forward and say, I'd like my child controlled. Now, good luck.
Why do you think that people are more comfortable talking about FGM than honor killings and forced marriages?
As I was saying that, I was realizing that that was going to be a controversial statement. There is I don't think it's necessarily true that they're more comfortable. I think that we are, because we are able to reach groups that are, like in schools, a group of girls who are voluntarily sitting to talk about this issue. One of the reasons why I think it becomes easier to talk about in a group in that setting is many of the girls have not yet been through it. As Ayaan is mentioning, there is it happens to some girls when they're very young. It also sometimes doesn't happen until later in their teenage years, and so there is a sense of realism. This is something that could happen to me. This happened to my mother. I understand what it is. I've read online, Medicinet or Yahoo or whatever it is, I've looked it up and I understand that it's not something I want to have happen to me. The implications can sometimes be more palpable, more understandable, that it has an impact on things that are actually important to teenage girls, like sexual pleasure and sexual drive and reproductive health, whereas of course the impact of forced marriage and honor crimes is important, of course, but they may not realize that until it's staring them in the face. And so I think sometimes it's something that's at the same time a bit more abstract and a bit more concrete, where it's easier to have a conversation. Now let's say On the other hand, if a woman has been through it, getting a young woman to come forward and say, this happened to me and I'm willing to talk to the press, or I'm willing to talk to my peers, or that is just as hard, I have found, on all these topics, because there is, as we said earlier, the sense of community is very strong and it's very important, and it's something that is very hard to just, as you said, close your eyes and imagine it go away. And so people are very scared to come forward and talk about it to the public.
Must come into it, talking about it in public.
Embarrassment?
Does embarrassment come into it as far as discomfort talking in public?
I think that for some people, sure, there is that. I think what I have heard more than anything, though, is, I mean, if you get into the details of what happened to a woman, of course there is embarrassment. But I think from the young women I've spoken with and the older women I've spoken with about why they are afraid, it's more that they don't want their families to know. They just don't want anybody to find out that they're speaking against something. Even if every woman in their family is against it, or every man in their family is against it, it's not the nuclear family that controls the decisions in the home. It's a community. It's a larger sense of family that we don't all have in our homes. And so that's especially in communities that are not majority communities in the US, in minority communities, hanging on to that community is very, very important. That's your identity. That's your safe space. So it's just too frightening. It's just too scary to speak out. And it's understandable. We've had a lot of our clients be willing to speak on condition of not showing their face, masking their voice, scrambling their voices, putting false names. But you know, that's as far as we've been able to get, really.
Folks, we need to wrap up here, but we do invite you to come and talk with us after the session is closed. Any questions you'd like to ask or any dialogue you want to have, please feel free to come up and talk with the folks. And let me...
And before you all leave, we'd like to do one last thing. So if you give me about 10 seconds before leaving, I'd appreciate it. Detective Boughey, we would like to present you with the Honor Award for the AHA Foundation for all of your help and being really the champion for our foundation in helping rescue girls. And you saved 2 lives for us and for those lives. So thank you.
Thank you for coming today, folks.